I'm very excited to have Earl back in person and excited to be here at Pale Fire. Third time is almost a lifetime achievement here at Books and Brews. Hall of Fame, that's right. You're a longtime journalist and the author of 9 nonfiction books, including the acclaimed New York Times bestselling Chesapeake Requiem. And our last discussion, which was Across the Airless Wilds, and hundreds of major features for magazines and newspapers. He lives and hikes. We just started talking about his AT through hike this year. I think that's worth applauding. Right here in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Afton. So let's give a warm welcome to Earl again.
Thank you. This is a great place to do this. What a great room.
Yeah.
And the first time I came here, it was similarly filled, and we just had a great time. Yeah. So I'm stoked to.
And there's great beer afterwards. We love that too. For us. You all enjoy it now. You've brought us so many important tales, from the watermen of the vanishing Tangier Island to across the wilds of Mars in a rover. And you've done it with such depth so that we feel it. What really drew you to this book, Hell Put to Shame, the 1929 Murder Farm Massacre and the Horror of America's Second Slavery? What drew you to this story about these farm murders in 1921 in Georgia, in this?
Well, the short answer is that I found out about them. I had no idea that they had occurred. I think most people have no idea that there was the second act for slavery in the United States after the 13th Amendment. And I was in the library at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, where I lived at the time, researching my 4th book, which was a history of the American highway system. And I was looking for a 3-line brief that I knew had run in the Times during this one week in March of 1921. So I was going through microfilm looking for this brief. And the brief announced that Congress had just passed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921. And 3 lines is probably what the occasion deserved. But I wanted to use it in the book to illustrate just how overlooked this landmark piece of legislation was. So I had to find it. So I'm going through page after page through this microfilm. And I kept on running into these headlines on the front page of the New York Times in March of 1921, talking about a murder farm, which is a phrase you don't see slung around too often, and also using a word I had never seen before, which was peonage, and talking about this trial down in Georgia that was bringing to light the fact that peonage was alive and well in America. And so I started reading the first story I ran into, and it described a wholesale massacre on this farm 40 miles southeast of Georgia that was a cover-up for the fact that the plantation owner had been engaged in debt slavery, which is what peonage is. And he had been holding young black men against their will, some of them for years, and treating them as, they were slaves. There was, in fact, in some ways, their situation was worse than people caught up in chattel slavery, and we can get into how it was worse later. But the more I read, the more I realized, oh my, the chapter of history that I'm completely ignorant about. And so I kind of lost interest in the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921 for the afternoon and spent the whole day going through microfilm reading each day's successive report about this trial. And by the end, I realized, this needs retelling.
When was that?
That would have been in 2006 or so.
Wow. So it's been...
This one gestated for a bit, yeah.
Yeah, gestation. Now, you also went down to Jasper County, Georgia, You walked the land that was the farm, and you went to the bridge that that the murder victims were thrown from, or the area where the bridge would have been. There was a note you said in the book about it's a country. This country was another Georgia. Can you describe this area for us?
Actually, I said it was another country. The Georgia was another country. But the country kind of was another Georgia too, I guess. Yeah. Now, that it's a at the time. Now, you got to understand, 1921 to 2022, when I spent an awful lot of time down in Jasper County, a lot changed. It went from an economy that was completely based on cotton to now it's just a giant tree farm. That whole part of Georgia is all they do is grow southern yellow pine, and it's now mechanized, so there's no need for a huge human labor force, and so everything about it is different. The population's lower, I think, in Jasper County than it has been at any point in its past, and it's just kind of an overlooked part of the state, yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time down there. And one of the reasons that it took so long to get the book started was that in 2006, when I discovered the story, I was a single dad and raising my daughter on my own. And I just couldn't get the time away to go down and spend weeks at a time in Georgia going through court records and property records and everything else that I had to do to really kind of put it together. Because as you might imagine, this wasn't a story that Jasper County or Central Georgia in general really wanted preserved and retold around the fire. This is a story if you talk to a lot of people in Jasper County today, they'll have no idea what you're talking about. They grew up not knowing about this. A lot of the perpetrators' kin who stayed in Jasper County grew up having no idea that Grandpa was a mass murderer, and that this court case opened the way for finally the destruction of this last vestige of slavery.
So peonage is not a term that all of us are familiar with. Do you have a definition of peonage?
Yeah, well, it's where we get the word peon. And it's debt slavery. It takes many different forms, but the form, I'll give you just a couple of the forms. One which is familiar, another one that won't be. The one that won't be probably is the one that really unfolds in the book. And that is that imagine yourself a young black man in Georgia in the teens and 20s, or anytime after the Civil War up until World War II. Georgia has on its books, as do all the states of the Deep South, a series of interlocking laws that were called the Black Codes. And after the Civil War, these were developed by the legislatures in each of these states to basically keep labor cheap, if not free. And so you had vagrancy laws that were developed strictly to target young black men. And those are the only people who were ever arrested for vagrancy in the Deep South. So say you're a young black man, you get picked up in Atlanta for vagrancy. You don't have a job, or you're in the process of looking for one and you haven't found one yet. You don't have a nickel in your pocket. You've broken the law. So you're hauled down to the magistrate. He assigns you a $5 fine. There is no way that you're going to be able to come up with $5 to pay that fine. So you're looking at the alternative, which is 6 months on the chain gang. So while you're in jail pondering this fate, in walks a farmer. He's from Jasper County, 40 miles away. And he says, look, I know you've probably done agricultural work. If you like, I can pay your fine and you can come work off your debts to society on my plantation. You can work out your term working for me, and it'll be like a home to you. It'll be a much better experience than working on the chain gang. And he would have been right. That chances are, if you're a young black man in Georgia in 1921, the only job you've had has been agricultural. So you figure, okay, odds are, I know how bad the chain gang is going to be. How can this be any worse? And so you go off with your would-be benefactor, and you find out that it can be a lot worse. Basically, you're locked in a bunkhouse with everybody else in the same situation, It's locked from the outside. You do all your work at the end of a gun barrel. You are beaten for any infraction, real or imagined, and most of them are imagined. If you try to run, you're killed. Simple as that. You're just going to be murdered, and no one will miss you. And chances are your family has no idea that you were even arrested. You haven't had the opportunity to contact them. They don't know that you're going to this plantation. In fact, chances are the jail doesn't keep a record that you're going to this plantation. So you basically vanish off the face of the earth when you go into this farmer's private employment. Maybe to be seen again, all too often never to be seen again. So that's one form of peonage. The more common form, and it's more subtle, so it's harder to see, was kind of baked into the whole sharecropping business. And sharecropping, the way it's supposed to work, is that you as a poor farmer can't afford your own land, so you go to work for a landowner. He basically gives you a tract of land to farm. He gives you the supplies you'll need to do that farming, and he gives you a house to live in usually. And you pay him back with half of the proceeds of whatever you grow that year. Now, the problem is that you don't get paid until the end of the year. You have to live while you're farming. And so the farmer will front you the supplies, food, whatever that you need to get through the time until harvest, and there's a payday. Well, all that works really well if the farmer is an upstanding individual and pays you, first of all, the actual market value of the crops you raise. Most did not. And doesn't overcharge you for any supplies you take from the commissary over the course of the year until you get paid. Most of them, again, do not. So you're hit with with this pincher's movement, kind of. You're overcharged during the year, and you are underpaid at the end of the year. And most years you wind up owing the farmer instead of getting paid. Now, the evil part of this is that because of those black codes on the books, the laws that are meant to keep you at work, you can't do anything about it. I mean, to question that white farmer's word, to ask to see his figures, for instance, will get you killed. I mean, this is Georgia. This is 1921. It wasn't a hell of a lot better in Virginia. There was a little bit better. And so, that this much quieter form of peonage just kept people in bondage for years and years and years. So they were never they can't leave the property. If they leave the property, they're going to be arrested and they're going to be sent back to the property. And chances are they're going to be killed as soon as they get back. They can do nothing to get out of the arrangement they have with their landlord. And, that amounts to slavery right there.
This is way past Civil War, and 1867 we outlawed that first form of peonage, right? All forms. I guess, how prevalent was it in the South, and who was responsible for enforcing the outlawing of it, the stopping of it?
Well, it was against federal law. In 1867, Congress passed the Peonage Act, the Anti-Peonage Act, but it was never against state law. And the southern states had a vested interest in keeping wages low, preserving as many aspects of slavery as they could just from a financial standpoint. And they did. They did a pretty good job of it. And so the Supreme Court issued, there were a number of DOJ investigations into the practice at the turn of the last century that kind of brought it into view for the feds. The feds were not all that aware of it until then. But, the problem is that to really prosecute it effectively, you need local law enforcement to help, and the local law enforcement was complicit. So, I mean, you're not getting any help from the people who actually know the lay of the land locally. And so what you'd see is there would be a lengthy federal investigation that would lead to a flurry of arrests, and then there wouldn't be any more prosecutions for years. And then you see another flurry, and occasionally the feds were able to get a toehold somewhere and actually put together a case. But often even if they did put together a case, a jury was deliberating for all of 30 seconds before they acquitted the defendant, and he walked. So it was a lot of effort for very little payoff.
So what happened to the John S. Williams farm in 1921?
Well, I'm not going to tell you how it turns out.
Okay.
Let's make that agreement now. But I'll tell you how the setup.
I was just going to say, everybody get another beer.
I'll tell you how it unfolded, how it came to light. And that is that in 1920, a couple of John S. Williams is the 54-year-old raw-boned father of 12 who owned a plantation in Jasper County, reputed to be the county's biggest landowner, pillar of his church, first citizen of Monticello, the county seat. John S. Williams had a bunch of peons on his plantation. And in 1920, two of them escaped separately, several months apart from each other. But both wound up in the Atlanta offices of what was then called the Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI. It was in its earliest days. And the FBI was the lead agency for investigating peonage. It's not something that its agents really looked forward to. For the reasons I just described, they worked there sometimes for years on a case and then watch the guy walk. White Southern juries just could not be depended on to do anything except acquit white defendants when they were accused of any crime involving black people. So, I think had only one of these peons walked into the Bureau of Investigation, this story may never have happened, but two of them wound up. And so they kind of created this critical mass. And the agents had other business down in central Georgia, so they figured, okay, well, we're down there doing this other business. We'll stop in and visit John S. Williams. So they go down and they visit the plantation. And Williams is happy to see them, seems eager to help in any way he can. Of course, he tells them, no, there's no one being kept against their will here. All my workers are happy. I wouldn't dream of locking anybody up at night. Well, they take a tour of the property and they find the bunkhouse with the locks on the outsides of the doors and the windows that bolt from the outside. And they find a number of other physical pieces of evidence that strongly suggest that a peonage operation is in fact underway here. And they interview several of the peons who are working in the fields, all of whom are just absolutely terrified to talk to these agents and won't say a thing. And of course, the agents, having interviewed many people before, can recognize terror when they see it. So they figure, okay, we're going to have to come back and figure out a way to get these guys away from John S. Williams and his sons. He had 3 grown sons who helped him manage the farm. And we're going to have to get them away so that they can speak freely. We're going to have to figure out how to do that. In the meantime, however, the case was stalled. But John S. Williams didn't know that the case was stalled. John S. Williams, all he saw as they drove off in their car were a couple of guys who were going to come back with an army of feds. And they were going to take his farm. They were going to arrest him and his sons. Everything he had worked for his entire life was going to be ruined. So I figured there was only one thing to do, and that was to destroy the evidence. So over the course of the next 2 weeks, he methodically murdered 11 people. I'm not giving away too much. This revelation comes early in the book. And he would have gotten away with it because, as I said before, these guys would have been missed by no one, except that he got fancy in the way he killed them. Instead of just killing people on his property and burying them right there where they would never have been found, he wanted to terrorize them. And so he would drive them to bridges spanning area rivers, have other black employees of his tie them up with wire and chain, weight them down with 100-pound bags of rocks, and throw them off the bridges alive into the rivers. And Georgia was experiencing a drought that spring in March of 1921, and the rivers ran low, and the bodies started coming up. And that's how he was discovered.
Yeah, that.
It's a tough story. I mean, there's just no way to sugarcoat the horror involved in this story. an evil, evil monster of a human being. But he had a lot of company.
Part of the book, you have characters who, the cast is wide, and you not just put that light on John S. Williams, but you do that strongly, but you look at those early leaders in the civil rights movement and what they were fighting for. So it's one of many stories throughout the book.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, the thing that I really came to love about researching the book had nothing to do with the murder case. I'm embarrassed to say I did not know who James Weldon Johnson was before I wrote this book. I had no idea. I'd never heard the name. And now I don't see how that could be. I mean, but, James Weldon Johnson, he ought to be on Mount Rushmore. He was the first black leader of the NAACP. He also, let me try to run through his CV here so I can explain to you why we should all know who James Weldon Johnson was. He was born in Florida in 1871. He went to Atlanta University, which at the time was that rare college in the South for black people. He then returned to Florida and opened he started the first high school for black students in Florida. He became the first black admitted to the Florida bar. I'm trying to think. Well, he became a poet and a best-selling poet. He became a songwriter with his brother. They wrote 200 Broadway hit songs over the course of a decade together. He wrote "Lift Every Voice and Sing," since considered the black national anthem. He and his brother did that. He was among the first blacks who served as a foreign service officer. He was a consul in Nicaragua and in Venezuela. And and then he was a columnist for the largest black weekly in America, a very popular columnist, which is how the NAACP's leadership found out about him. They drafted him into the organization in 1915, and as a field secretary, he made the NAACP truly national. He went out, they had, I think, 55 locations when he came in, none of them in the South, or there were 3 in the South. One of them was Key West, which doesn't even count as the South, really, but I mean, there was just no Southern presence. And so he went in and just remade everything. And the NAACP went from having like a couple of thousand members when he came in to having 100, 200,000 by 1920. It was just crazy what he was able to do. And then eventually he became the first black executive secretary of the group, and came into office about 2.5 months before all this nastiness came. So this was one of the very first things he got to work on as the boss. And he had as his lieutenant one of the most remarkable figures in American history, but not as laudable in some ways, but just really interesting. And
again, you did that. It's like you brought us into that time and space, like you did with the Waterman in Tangier, of deeply the depth by which we examine these people. Hugh Dorsey, the governor,
we'll
Clifford Manning, these people. I wondered, like, and I hear probably it was and I'll have to remember his name too, but this gentleman who kind of haunted you for the 17 years.
James Weldon Johnson.
James Weldon, yeah.
Now that's James Weldon Johnson there. On the left. Now his protege was this guy, Walter F. White. Walter F. White was a black man who could pass, and who could pass so effectively that he became the NAACP's secret weapon. And after a lynching or a race riot, the NAACP would dispatch him right into the middle of the maelstrom, and he'd interview all the people who were responsible and then file a report and take it to the proper authorities. And the locals never were the wiser to it until he was long out of town. He had a lot of really close calls, but he never got caught. And he later became the executive secretary of the NAACP. In fact, was the longest serving secretary in the organization's history to date. But
I'm sure we could be here all night discuss, because there's so much depth and detail of characters and times that maybe wouldn't have been brought to light. So
and Hugh Dorsey, you mentioned him.
Right. And I won't
who was the governor of Georgia, by the way, and very typical of his time, a white son of the South, not one to rock the boat,
right,
but he decided to rock the boat. And this case emboldened him to do it. And he made a difference. Although he's been pretty much written out of Georgia history for doing so.
What was the title of his paper that he produced?
It was a statement by Governor Hugh Dorsey as to the state of the Negro in Georgia, which was kind of shortened just to either the Negro in Georgia or the statement, depending on what media outlet you were reading.
Illuminating lynching and peonage and other acts that were very cruel.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was a Democrat, and Democrats were not Democrats the way they are now. The parties had kind of the reverse orientation towards racial matters back then. And that didn't change until the New Deal, really. Dorsey had done nothing to indicate that he was going to be a racially progressive governor. But when this case came through, he made damn sure that the state prosecuted John S. Williams, even though Jasper County wasn't inclined to go after its leading citizen. And after that, again, emboldened by what he had done, he issued the statement, and the statement enumerated 135 crimes against blacks that had occurred since he had been in office. And it pulled no punches at all. It was an amazingly candid document for its day. And I think it shocked everybody in and out of Georgia. The New York Times loved him for it, but I think the New York Times was just gobsmacked that he had done it. And so everybody was. James Weldon Johnson was, and they became strong allies in this particular little piece of the civil rights struggle.
Well, we haven't gotten to trial or any of those details and the parts out of that, but I do look at where we're at, and I'm thinking we should kind of go to questions from you all, and we can come back to those questions. But I'm going to look out, and if anybody has some questions now, yeah. Question is, how did the New York Times get the story?
Well, the way newspapers, back when we had newspapers, always got stories, which was that, you had, in this case, a local paper that covered the discovery of the first bodies in the Yellow River in Newton County, one county over from Jasper, on a Sunday in March of 1921. And that little newspaper wrote it up in a big way, as you'd expect. And it was picked up by the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, or the Atlanta Constitution. And once the Atlanta paper got a hold of it, of course, it went out on the wire. And so the Times would have picked it up initially from a wire report, and then they eventually sent their own reporting team down.
How was the little newspaper allowed to print that story?
Well, the second part of that question is the more interesting, and I can't answer that, except that a couple of little newspapers actually had reporters there at the bridge that day. The newspaper in Newton County, based in Covington, was present, but I'm pretty sure the paper in Jackson, which is in Butts County, just south of Newton, was there as well. And actually, Jackson was closer to where it was happening. And this was, why Williams chose to throw two guys chained to each other off this particular bridge is a question, because 14 miles from his house. It was a long drive in the cars of the day and the roads of the day, and he could have been caught at any point. It was risky. It was weirdly, stupidly risky, and he did it anyway. But it could have been that he just wanted to get far enough away from his own place that if the bodies were found, they wouldn't be traced back to him, and that was a miscalculation on his part. But the newspapers had their fingers on the pulse of the population pretty well. They lived in the communities they covered, and these little newspapers were on it within an hour of the bodies being discovered. And this the bridge that we're talking about here, Allen's Bridge over the Yellow River, it's a rural spot today. I mean, it's out in the middle of nowhere. Now, the bridge has been replaced with a concrete bridge, and the road that went out there has been shifted about 1,000 feet to the south. But you can stand on the new bridge and look upriver and see the pylons for the old bridge, which is washed away, but the pylons are still there. And I took a boat up and inspected it, and you can see where the old road came in. It was a dirt road, of course, and caught the bridge, and you can see the abutments at both sides where the bridge met the land. But it's impossible to imagine that when these bodies were discovered, it was a Sunday morning they were discovered, and by noon, a couple hours later, there were 200 people standing on the bridge watching a coroner's inquest take place down on a sandbar in the river where these bodies were laid out. And the idea that news would travel, would be telegraphed with such lightning speed, given the rustic, technology of the day, especially in Newton County, is nuts. And that a crowd that size would show up at this bridge that now is in the middle of nowhere. Back then, it was, the edge of it was beyond. And I guess this is a long way of saying I have no idea how they found out, but they were there. They were there right away.
How can bringing these things to light be beneficial to the collective soul of America today?
Well, I think we're only I think our strength as a culture and as a people rests first on our being honest about ourselves. And the fact is, we've got some dark corners in our past. We've got a lot of them. But this was one that struck me as remarkable because it's recent, for one thing, and because it was so completely unknown. It's another chapter to a story that we think we all know. At least I was smugly self-satisfied that slavery ended with the 13th Amendment. I thought we didn't have to worry about it after that, and had no clue that there was this, this thing lurched along for 3 more generations after that, at least 3 more. So it's not medicine that goes down easy. Granted, it's not an easy story to get your head around, but I think that we owe it to ourselves to be honest about who we are, where we've been. That's how we get better. That's the only way we get better.
I'm going to second that. Yes.
Yes, sir.
So just summing up the last part of that is, what can today's leaders learn from your book? And thank you for reporting here.
First of all, what newspaper are you with?
Daily News Record, just down the street.
Awesome. Good for you. Good for you.
Record.
Fantastic. How long have you been there? How long have you been in the business?
For close to 30 years.
Okay.
I was at the Daily News Record from 2003 to 2006, and I came back in March.
Okay. Where were you in between?
Everywhere.
That used to be the strength of the newspaper business. You go to any town in America and you get a job. If you knew how to write, you'd get a job at the paper. And there was no funnier, faster, smarter room in town than the city room of the local paper. I mean, that's what I miss about it. I don't miss the writing, 6 stories a day necessarily, but I sure do miss the banter. I miss being surrounded by book smart misfits and wise asses, and
We've got plenty of those.
people who are way smarter than the people that we covered. At least we told ourselves that. So what was your question again? I've completely forgotten it.
Leaders. What can today's leaders learn?
Well, but I'm kind of amazed that it hasn't been banned in Florida, to tell you the truth. But I don't understand the reluctance of our political leaders to talk about difficult subjects. I don't understand it. It makes no sense to me. I'm mystified by this whole book burning business. I can't answer your question because I don't get what's going on in their heads. I'm maybe giving them more credit than they deserve with that last part, but.
Is James Weldon Johnson's history taught in Florida? Is it?
I don't think James Weldon Johnson is actively taught anywhere on a, below a college level, unless you have specific courses in some like AP programs or whatever that deal with like the civil rights movement from its earliest days. Because, somehow we have come to understand or to believe incorrectly that the civil rights movement had its beginnings in the 1950s, that it's a post-war phenomenon, where while really, if you go back to the teens and the 20s, what these guys did back then was so much more dangerous. They didn't have a national news crew, along at the Edmund Pettus Bridge recording everything that happened. When you were an NAACP representative in 1921 and you went down to Alabama, say, to do your work, you were stepping into the unknown, truly the unknown. You were a black man, and it was always men back then. You were a black man in a place that profoundly didn't want you there, and whose people were willing to take pretty extreme measures to dissuade you from doing your job. And there are a couple of cases in the book where people who worked for the NAACP were attacked. James Weldon Johnson was threatened openly with being lynched by a newspaper editor of all things in an editorial. The guy actually put it in print. The Cordial Dispatch, for those of you who plan a vacation to Georgia anytime soon.
Yeah, and doing your research, you were dealing with the Deep South, and what kind of blowback did you get from people who didn't want to talk about this history?
It's a great question. And I expected quite a bit and got none. I got nothing but cooperation. People at the courthouse in Jasper County, they knew nothing about it. And when I told them enough about it that they could, to give them the tools to help me find what I was looking for, they were fascinated. They wanted to get to the bottom of it. No, they couldn't believe that Granddad didn't tell them what had happened, just yesterday, basically. And I found that time and time again. The sheriff in Jasper County went out and looked for the bodies of the dead peons for me. I searched for 3 days, could not find them. Jasper County has lost its old pauper cemetery. They probably built over the damn thing, but it's just gone without any record. And so I studied old maps. I went through property records. I did everything I could think of to try to find where this cemetery was. There are 8 guys, at least 8 guys, probably all 11 are buried there. They were buried in unmarked graves, but they were buried in a pretty finite space. And so I was able to narrow it down. The space occupied a place that now is shared by the sheriff's office, the Department of Public Works, which has a big gravel pile in the middle of it, and animal control, which has all of the strays caged up there. And I couldn't narrow it down beyond that. So I walked these woods. I was talking to the guys that, and there's also a landfill. I was talking to the guys at the landfill and asking if, they had seen any sign of a cemetery in their decades of working at this dump. And they had not, but they said, look, there's only one piece of this property that hasn't changed all that much over the years, and it's the woods out by the road. That's probably where this cemetery was. And so I walked the woods for 3 days and did a grid pattern, just tried to find some sign of a burial ground, found nothing. So I enlisted the help of the sheriff, and damned if he didn't bring some inmates from the jail out to walk a grid pattern on another piece of property behind the senior center. That's also there. The county crammed a lot of stuff in this one area.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Well, if you're in Jasper County, you only have one place to go, basically, to get all of your business attended to from birth to death. But every time I asked for help, they were eager to give it. And Jasper has been overlooked. It's kind of the Timbuktu of Georgia in some ways, overlooked by time and progress and everything else. And their one kind of brief kind of sideswipe with modern life is that Jasper and its county seat, Monticello, they were the setting for most of My Cousin Vinny. So all the exterior courthouse scenes occur outside the Jasper County Courthouse in Monticello. And there's a courthouse green there that Joe Pesci and Marissa Tomei take off from at the end of the movie, and that's in there. The sack of suds where the shooting took place that opens the story actually exists and is actually called the sack of suds. They didn't change anything for that. But anyway, so their one little taste of notoriety was that, and it's been a while since My Cousin Vinny was made, and it could be that folks just felt that it was time to put Jasper back on the map again for reasons good or bad.
Just comment a little bit on how, well, I was talking about the late.
Yeah, you're talking about the last picture right here in the 1950s probably. Yeah. I have another picture where they're all wearing Bermuda shorts. Almost put that in there, but
Comment on what?
Just a comment on, with you talking with your descendants who seem to honestly have had no idea what happened, but to me, it would have been hard not to judge them by what their grandfathers and or great-grandfather took part in.
Well, I think that they, now there were 12 kids. One of them was judged insane at age 13. And so she kind of left the picture there. She went to Milledgeville, the state, the state hospital, and never left. Of the other 11, only one stayed in Jasper County, and she had no idea. Nobody ever talked about this. When she got into her late teens or so, she started hearing little bits and pieces around the county, and she asked her mom about it. And her mom gave her a very sanitized version of the story in which Granddad heard her father. This would have been John S. Williams' daughter saying this. He and a number of other farmers in the county employed some black convicts to work their fields, and there was some a violent altercation of some sort. There was an escape, and in the course of trying to round everybody up, some of the convicts were killed accidentally. And then Grandpa took the rap for all of his friends. And what a stand-up guy to go down and go to jail for his friends. So that's the way this got, translated as it was passed to succeeding generations. Now, the kids themselves, the young kids of John S. Williams, when he did this, he had kids ranging in age from 31 to 2. So he had a bunch of little toddlers, and they have no firsthand recollection of this whatsoever. But the other kids all knew what had happened. And they wound up in Texas and Florida, most of them. And they never told their own kids about it until, again, little bits and pieces start coming out. Some of the older relatives would make comments that, the kids were curious about. And then the big thing that happened in the 1990s, a reporter from Atlanta, a guy named Greg Freeman, started putting together a book on the case. His book is called Lay This Body Down. I'm not a fan of the book. It gets a lot of stuff wrong. But he contacted some of the family members, and that's the first they heard about it. And then they went back to their parents and said, what's this we hear about Granddad? And so they got a more complete accounting at that point. But it's they did a great job of just shutting up about it. And yeah, I mean, that picture of them on vacation and the picture of them in Bermuda shorts, they didn't have a care in the world. I mean, not Leroy, but Hewland, who is this guy up here. Hewland became a very rich man. He owned a chain of gas stations in and around Tampa, and then built that into motels and convenience stores, and the company's still going. And now it's this huge convenience store chain. So it's they weren't hurt by it. No, that did not. There was a clean break.
How much?
They left Georgia with nothing, because when John S. Williams had to liquidate all of his property just to get legal representation. He was cash poor and land rich, and so he just had to cash out. So even if he hadn't, well, the best case scenario for him was that he'd have to start over.
How much is it a true crime piece? Or how much does it reflect on peonage in general? Like, what is the ratio?
God, I don't know. I mean, I don't think of it as a true crime story in any sort of the usual sense of that. I use the criminal case as an entree to talk about bigger stuff. And really, I think in many ways the most interesting figures in the book have nothing to do firsthand with the criminal case. The NAACP folks and Hugh Dorsey clearly were operating at a distance from all that, but they wind up being some of the most fascinating characters in the story. So 50-50 maybe, but it's all, but the criminal stuff is in service of the bigger story.
Thoughts on the grayscale of peonage and how in the modern fashion it can be grade into okay.
Oh, I don't think anybody ever thought it was okay. I mean, even the people involved in it knew that they were doing something bad. That's why they kept a lid on the whole thing. And when cases would come into the public light, before and after this case, I don't recall ever seeing anyone racing to the defense of the perpetrators necessarily. They'd make excuses for it before arrests were made, maybe, but once arrests were made, it got a little too hot for most people, I think, and so you didn't see. Now, what you did see was, and how can I do this without giving away too much? What you did see was stuff like in John S. Williams's case, he died in 1932, and when he died, his obit was this glowing, "We've lost one of our best." It made no mention at all of the fact that he was, at the center of the biggest criminal case in Jasper County history. Not even hinted at. And, Jasper County packed the Monticello Baptist Church for his funeral. I mean, absolutely packed, to the point where there were so many flowers, apparently you couldn't see the altar. And so, while they didn't necessarily try to soft pedal the severity of what he had done while it was being adjudicated, they were all too willing to forgive him on the backside of the whole thing. You know, he just got caught. That's the bottom line. You know, now you talk to people in Jasper County, they are horrified that this happened there, and you know, this is a county like every small county in Georgia that has, you know, Johnny Reb on the courthouse square, but the same is true here in Virginia, you know, and if you go and read the inscription on that Johnny Reb statue, it pretty much goes out of its way to be obnoxious. And if I were a black resident of Jasper County, I'd have a real problem with it. But then again, I moved to Norfolk in 1987 and to cover City Hall. And my first day as a reporter for the Virginian Pilot, I walked into the city council chambers, and the city council was doing business in front of the Confederate battle flag. So my first column for the newspaper, when I became a columnist, was talking about how 123 years after Appomattox, Norfolk was still fighting the Civil War. And the flag came down the next day, I'm happy to say. That was in 1988. But, so we're not out of the woods, you know, completely. We're still mired in our past to some extent. And sometimes it takes, you know, a big mouth Yankee like I was coming into Norfolk to say, hey, you know, maybe that's not the way to do things. Then again, you kind of hope that would be homegrown.
What do you think is worse, being ignorant to the history that you live in, or actively trying to cover it up?
Oh, well,
What is
actively
worse?
trying to work to cover it up is certainly worse.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you're kind of pitiable if you're ignorant, but there's nothing to pity if you're actively involved in the cover-up. And you know, bringing up Nazis is and kind of what the German population has had to do to, you know, come to a reckoning about its past. A lot of parallels. You know, I mean, that's a great parallel for what we're talking about here. It's.
I guess, you know, in terms of what do you feel is the greatest? I know it was hard to read. It was very hard. And yet felt like I was exploring and finding things I didn't learn about. What do you feel is the greatest tragedy of this story?
Well, I guess the greatest tragedy is that peonage still crops up from time to time. You know, as horrific as this story is, and as much as you would love for it to mark the complete eradication of the practice, the fact is it's still with us. It's morphed a little bit. It no longer targets black people. It targets immigrants and the homeless. You know, now someone who wants to run a peonage operation will show up in New Orleans or Houston at a homeless shelter. They'll seek out people who are addicted to meth or other drugs, and they will hire them, and they will keep them addicted on the job. And if they attempt to leave, they'll pull back on the drugs. In the case of immigrants, of course, they take their passports and their visas as soon as they and often actually arrange for them to come into the country, and then once here, they've got them. You know, there was a huge ring that was busted by the feds that was operating in a bunch of southeastern states. This is maybe 5 years ago. And they found that they were taking people from Thailand, and they were bringing them over, and they were charging them for the cost of their transportation to get here. So they start out their relationship with their supposed benefactors in debt. Now, if they couldn't come up with the money for the plane ticket and for all the other jacked up fees that these guys had laid on them, then the people running the operation offered to make a loan to them that they secured with with a deed to the peon's parents' property. So now if the peon gets over here and decides they can't take it and they're gonna run, they know that if they do so, the people who brought them are not only going to screw them, but they're going to go after mom and dad, everything mom and dad have worked for. And, so it's that kind of operation that you see in play now. It's not threatening to kill people. It's threatening to ruin them, destroy them in other ways.
Well, I thank you again for tonight, for bringing a story that we can't forget to us. He'll be here to sign books for folks. We have books over here. Next month, we'll be back here at Pale Fire on February 11th. Rebecca Kaufman, I'll Come to You. She's been here before as well. So this is our returning guest authors series. So thank you again. Let's give Earl a round.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming out tonight.